Dovrei fazer uns novidades.
Está na altura, não é? De começar, não é?
Good afternoon and welcome to the 9th conference of the European Society for the History of Science, which should have taken place in Bologna. And unfortunately, due to the COVID emergency, it's moved now online. So you all are aware of the technical challenges. I'd like to ask everybody to be mindful of a kind of etiquette for teams to keep the microphones switched off. But also I'd like to announce that the events of this afternoon are all available via the link on the website in the final program through Teams, but also through YouTube streaming. So if you can't get into the room for the Teams plenaries this afternoon, you can follow us via YouTube, and the link is on the website. So don't feel left out. Just join us through YouTube. So today's events start with a series of welcoming greetings. We start now with the Magnifico Rettore of the University of Bologna, the Chancellor of the University of Bologna, Francesco Bertini, who will give you a short welcome via video that is going to be launched now.
Dear participants, on behalf of the Alma Mater Studiorum, I welcome to Bologna. The constraints imposed by the COVID emergency forced us to meet on a virtual platform. But thanks to the efforts of the local organizers, I hope you'll be able to appreciate the richness of the Bologna's collections related to the history of science and interdisciplinary dynamism of our scientific community. Bologna is one of the major centers for the study of the history of science in Italy. And this distinguished tradition goes back a long time. Since the later Middle Ages, Bologna has been at the core of significant developments in European medicine, natural philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and a wide spectrum of other emerging scientific disciplines. Over the centuries, the city and its university have collected and preserved a vast amount of documentation that traces the practice and evolution of these disciplines within a variety of institutional and civic contexts. As a result, Bologna can prize itself for hosting some of the richest archives for the history of science and medicine in Europe. The anatomical teaching of Mondino degli Ufsi in the 14th century, the birth of one of the first proper scientific museums through the remarkable legacy of Ulisse Aldrovandi, and the development of mechanical philosophy around Marcello Malpighi are only three of the many scientific achievements associated with the city and its university that had attracted the attention of international scholars. Bologna is also home to the world's first woman university professor, having appointed her the chair of physics, then known as natural philosophy, in 1732, at a time in which women were generally excluded from intellectual professions and learning. The city of Bologna was also home to another remarkable female scientist, Anna Morandi Manzolini, who became professor of anatomy at the Academy of Sciences of Bologna in 1756. By the late 19th century, Bologna hosted the first chairs in the history of medicine and mathematics, and immediately after the process of Italian unification, it became one of the leading universities where different traditions in the historiography of science first developed in Italy. These traditions, now open to global influences, have continued to flourish to this day. With its venerable past, Bologna thus represents the perfect backdrop for an international conference in the history of science. This is the first time since the 8th International Congress in the History of Science in Florence in 1956 that an international conference of this sort returns to you.
Eh bien, du coup, on verra qui va candidater.
From as far as India, US, Australia have chosen to
Parce qu'on a ouvert pour toi.
Okay. Range of documents and specimens from the civic and university collections. These collections and the network of scholars who have researched them deserve to be better known, and this conference can act as a catalyst for further scholarly exchange among historians and cultural operators, and facilitate the dissemination of the remarkable scientific and cultural heritage of this wonderful city, putting Bologna once again at the center of the attention. This meeting will facilitate a dialogue between museum curators and librarians working in Bologna and experts on other national and international collections to foster interdisciplinary and cross-cultural research on this and other sources in the history of science, and make them more widely accessible through the use of the latest technologies. In short, this conference wishes to both promote the rich cultural heritage of Bologna and to celebrate its long-lasting international vocation. So thank you and enjoy the conference.
And now I'd like to leave the floor to the President of the European Society for the History of Science, Anna Simoes, who is going to introduce and welcome you all to the conference.
So, hello everybody. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to the 9th European Society for the History of Science Conference on Visual, Material and Sensory Cultures of Science, which is jointly organized, as you know, by the European Society for the History of Science and the Italian Society for the History of Science. The decision to organize this meeting in Bologna was approved back in 2018 at the General Assembly, which took place in London in the previous biennial meeting, and was, of course, then discussed extensively with all parties involved during 2019 and the very early months of 2020. No one could predict then that European Society, the Italian Society, and the Bologna Local Organizing Committee would face the incredible challenge to organize the first, and I stress, the first big virtual conference in our field, taking place from today until the 3rd of September. When Italy was dramatically ravaged by the COVID-19 pandemics, the courage, professionalism, and stamina of the Italian Society and local organizing committee managed to prepare for us a virtual meeting involving nearly 600 participants from 40 countries and taking place in 11 parallel sessions. Besides, as you have noticed by browsing the program, it also includes today 5 plenary lectures of the European Society, the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize, presidential address, and 3 early career lectures. Also 2 sessions dedicated to the early career network of the European Society. And also it includes, of course, organizational matters, sessions organized by the European Society, like Scientific Board, which took place before these opening remarks, and the General Assembly, which will close this conference. There are parallel events which are included and which promise to be very interesting roundtables, one following a documentary on the Eduardo Amaldi, the other on the digital life of objects and images. But parallel social events may take place among members if they wish so, like a discussion over a virtual beer or a virtual meal. Our incursions into the virtual format will certainly turn these alternative meeting places into avenues for further exploration in the future. They have come to stay. So please be creative in these alternative meeting spots. But in my view, while they are nice complements, they are not substitute for live encounters among community members. To paraphrase the topic of this conference, they explore the visual, but not the material, and the sensory aspect central to all human interactions. Adjustments then to the virtual format were supported by the commitment and the expertise of the Bologna IT personnel, helped by many graduate students, to whom go my deepest thanks, and who worked under the guidance of the organizing committee. Ezio Vaccari, the president of the Italian Society, will probably go into more details about this aspect than I can possibly tackle here. In what relates to the sessions, which are at the core of European Society life, adjustments to the virtual format were especially challenging in what concerns the voting for new officers and scientific board members, which will take place during the General Assembly. I'm especially grateful to Simon Turchetti, European Society Secretary, for having taken this extra task upon himself. They also involve the 5 plenaries, which will be delivered sequentially after this session in a concise format specially adapted to a virtual conference. Following the London conference, 3 instead of 2 early career lecturers were selected, and contrary to London, their lectures will take 20 minutes and not 45. It was also agreed that these 3 lectures will be submitted to Centaurus, the official journal of the European Society, in paper format by December 2020, in order to be published during 2021, therefore allowing to meet the needs of fast publication of early career scholars. The Gustav Neuenschwander Prize and the presidential address will also be delivered after this session in a concise format and readdressed in full in the European Society meeting of 2022, together with the medal awarding ceremony accompanying the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize. As such, we worked out a sort of continuity between the 2 succeeding biennial conferences of the European Society, and so we will extend the Bologna spirit into 2022. It is therefore, in this context, my great pleasure to invite publicly Ezio Vaccari, the president of the Italian Society, to attend the next conference in 2022 and be present at least during the half day dedicated to the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize and the presidential address of 2020. In this symbolic way, the Society will be able to restore the material and the sensory aspects of interactions among members of our community, which the pandemics so dramatically stripped out from the Bologna conference. I take the opportunity to thank the Magnifico Rector of the University of Bologna for the willingness to host this conference, the Department of Philosophy and Communication for supporting it enthusiastically, And I thank also heartily Ezio Vaccari and Maria Conforti, respectively President and Vice President of the Italian Society, as well as all members of the organizing committee, most especially Marco Beretta, Elena Canadelli, Sandra Lingueri, and Paolo Savoia, all involved in the challenging task of organizing such a groundbreaking conference in Bologna, the first virtual conference of its dimension in our discipline. I'm sure this conference will become a striking example of the adaptive creativity of our community in facing the challenges posed by the virtual world of conferences, and the honor for this goes entirely to them. The European Society conferences are special forums to affirm the European Society vision of a plural history of science in its various dimensions, geographic, career and gender-wise, but also thematic and methodological. They do so by meeting the needs of an ever more diverse and multi-continental European society constituency in an open dialogue with other historians of science and other colleagues from other disciplines. This conference program and participation offers a vibrant example of such plurality. European Society conferences also materialize some of the ways in which the European Society acknowledges, on the one hand, the guiding responsibility of lifelong achievements in the history of science, and also, on the other hand, supports its early career members. The highest recognition of the European Society is its Gustav Neuenschwander Prize, which comes with a medal and a financial reward, which was created in 2011 by Erwin Neuenschwander in memory of his father Gustav. I take this opportunity to thank heartily Erwin for his steady support of the European Society. You have been a main pillar of our society. From this year onwards, the Gustav Neuenschwander awardee is invited to assess in his or her lecture the state of the history of science broadly conceived in a connection with past and present historiographical trends informing the dynamics of the international community of historians of science. Although yet less known, because much more recent than the Saturn Medal awarded by the History of Science Society since 1955 and the Leonardo da Vinci Medal awarded by the Society for the History of Technology since 1962, the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize awarded by the European Society for the History of Science is no less prestigious. Former Gustav Neuenschwander Prize awardees include Claude Debreu, Jürgen Rehn, Nancy Siraisi, also a Saturn medalist, and Robert Fox, also a Saturn medalist. The Gustav Neuenschwander Prize, the Gustav Neuenschwander awardee for 2020 is the reputed historian of science Kostas Gavroglu. I take this opportunity to congratulate him in public, not only personally, but also on behalf of the European Society Scientific Board and the prize committee members. This is a most deserved award for his prominent contributions to the historiography of science, to the renovation of our understanding of crucial historical episodes, and to the life of the international community of historians of science, with a special focus on emerging communities within Europe. I look forward to Kostas Gavroglu's address, which will certainly be a very fine example of the promises offered by the historiographical twist shaping the Gustav Neuenschwander lectures. In respect to the guiding role of lifelong achievements, I extend my congratulations to two members of the European Society for the History of Science, whose work and careers have been recently recognized by prestigious sister scientific societies. I congratulate Karine Chemla, former European Society President, for having been awarded the Otto Neugebauer Prize for 2020 of European Mathematical Society for highly original and influential work in the field of history of mathematics. And I also congratulate Jean Bennett for being awarded the Saturn Medal of the History of Science Society, which for the first time acknowledges the importance of material culture in our discipline, one of the very topics at the center of our conference. I am sure that other prestigious recognitions will soon follow, recognizing the lifelong achievements of active members of our board. The European Society recognition for lifelong commitments to the discipline goes hand in hand with its steady support of early career members. The early career plenary lectures, which started in 2016, invite early career colleagues to choose and present their assessment of fields or topics within the history of science broadly conceived that have received considerable attention and or have generated fresh approaches to the discipline in recent years, and which may significantly contribute to alter and circulate new concepts, methods, and ideas within the history of science. Of the 12 candidates proposed by the European Society members in 2019, a 4-member selection committee prepared an ordered list on the basis of the quality of the candidates' early career records, the originality of their proposals, and their suitability for a broad audience. The European Society Scientific Board then chose the first 3 early career scholars of this list to become the lecturers in 2020. I heartily congratulate Clara Florenza, Paolo Savoia, and Sitska Fransen, and look forward to their lectures and their following publication in Centaurus. The virtual format of this conference also enabled the European Society for the History of Science to support 25 early career participants, 2/3 of which are graduate students, with grants which covered their registration instead of the former 4 or 5 participants supported in the past. The Early Career Network, created in September 2018, which now gathers around 150 early career members, features also prominently in the conference program, with 2 dedicated sessions, one which was led by Koen Vermeer on Centaurus mentoring program right before these opening remarks, and the other which will terminate this long day and exciting day today, led by Mathieu Husson, to discuss and plan future networking activities. It follows also the highly successful organization of their first meeting, which took place in September 2019 in Paris, and which was a high success. The European Society Scientific Board looks forward to their future actions. They will certainly signal the Society's growing vitality. The fact of the matter is that European Society membership has grown roughly by a factor of 10 in the past 6 years, and now includes almost 600 members. If it is the first time you are attending a biennial conference of the European Society, you realized that your registration fee includes the European Society membership for 2021 and 2022 at a reduced price, with access to Centaurus, the official journal of the Society. I welcome you as a member, but either as a new member or as a past member who has just renewed his or her membership, I exhort you all to become active in the life of the Society. It's not the number of members that counts, but of course, that their steady involvement in the life of the Society. Because of this, and in order to better assess the needs of our community, we launched in early 2020 a survey called Mapping the European Society for the History of Science Community. The survey addresses the training, the scientific and professional profile of the European Society members, their mobility, publication patterns, and ability to cater for European Union funding. I urge you to respond to it if you have not yet done so. Just go to the European Society website, you'll see survey, click there, and it takes you just 10 minutes. So far, we have around 100 answers, but we would like to have much more before proceeding to their analysis and the preparation of the final report. Last but not least, I call your attention to Centaurus, the official journal of the Society. The journal features now various typologies of issues, different sorts of sections, and a closer association with European Society than ever before. This is mostly due to the persistent and creative commitment of its chief editor, Koen Vermeer. It publishes, for example, the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize lectures, the presidential addresses, the early career scholars lectures. It also has signaled the 15th anniversary of the Society with memories of its past presidents. The diversity fostered by the European Society as regards to the profile of its members, geographical provenance, training, career stage, and approach to the discipline have been reflected in Centaurus, giving it a very broad and original profile. In fact, presently, around 90% of its authors are members of the European Society. But we should all strive to get Centaurus into the radar of the extended community of historians of science. So, exhort colleagues from everywhere in the world to submit papers to Centaurus. Resulting from the European Society calls for special issues, various issues have been thematic. A call for special thematic issues for 22 and 23 is now open. I'm sure that many symposiums in this conference will constitute fertile ground for very interesting proposals. I urge you to keep this call in mind and respond to it. Koen Vermeer, Centaurus chief editor, will address these issues in a few moments in more detail. I end these opening remarks by wishing you a very fulfilling conference, hoping that you will be able to profit from its various sessions and activities, and that you will enjoy to be an active part of this groundbreaking conference, the first of its dimension in our discipline. Thank you.
And thank you very much to Anna Simoes for this wonderful, warm and welcoming presentation. And also very informative because it's giving us an outline of the various plenaries this afternoon. So now I'd like to give the floor to Koen Vermeer for a brief talk about the journal of the Society, Centaurus or Centaurus, depending on your nationality.
Of the language, right. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm Koen Vermeer, as Anna said, editor-in-chief of Centaurus. And as you all know, Centaurus is the official journal of the European Society for the History of Science. I hope you can see my slides by now. And thank you so much to the Society, and especially the presidents and the board, for the continued support over the last 2 years for the journal. It's been amazing to work together with you and to try to make the journal better and more efficient. As I'm just wanting to briefly highlight our core values, that we would really want to become as author-friendly as possible, very efficient, to publish the highest quality material, and to be inclusive. Anna already hinted to that as well. I'm not going to go into details of what we have been doing over the last 2 years, but maybe just on author-friendliness, let me say that we don't impose any specific conditions for manuscripts when you want to submit them. So there is not an official word limit or anything. So feel free to submit anything that you think would fit into Centaurus. We have a mentoring program for young scholars, and we also provide a free copy editing service. So I think these are already great points to increase author-friendliness of the journal. I would like to highlight a few points. For instance, here submissions have increased significantly over the last 2 years, and I would like to thank every one of you for submitting your work to Centaurus. After all, it's the support of the Society, of the members, of the author that makes the journal into a flourishing journal. And maybe more importantly for you, I don't know, would be to know about time to publication, from submission to publication. And I'm happy to say that that time decreased significantly, and I think it will continue to decrease even a bit more. And that is really due to the work of a fantastic editorial team that I've been working with. They've been doing great work. And again, thank you all very much, because you've been great reviewers for Centaurus, and sometimes willing to review in a time space of 2 or 3 weeks. And from what I've seen is all the reviews have been really very constructive and very useful to the authors. So thank you very much for that continued commitment to the journal and to really making it into an efficient and flourishing space. As a result of that, we were able to publish 6 issues in the last 6 months on very interesting topics, very diverse also, on the history of experimentation, the history of epidemics and COVID-19, on the history of editorship, a kind of anniversary issue of the periodic system, and then 2 issues on the history of technology. And thank you very much also to the guest editors of these issues. Again, it's all due to you and your work. The members of the society really make the journal into a great place to publish. So thank you so much for putting all the work in creating these fantastic issues. Maybe last but not least, you all have free access to Centaurus. Don't forget that. You just have to go to the webpage of the society. On the right side, there is a special tab for Centaurus. And if you go there, there is a very simple procedure. So I encourage you, I mean, you're all online anyway, so maybe just go there now, go to the website, get your code to get access to Centaurus, and just log in, and then you will be logged in and you will have access for the coming years. So I think that is a fantastic benefit our members have right now, that they everyone has access to Centaurus. Maybe while you're on the website, also fill in the survey that Anna mentioned. I think that would be great also for the society to get your input on that. Now, for the next years, I really count on you to continue to support Centaurus and to make this into a great journal, really to make this into the European journal for the history of science. That would be fantastic. And as Anna suggested, I'm looking forward to reading the results of this conference. I'm sure, and I'm looking forward to listening to the results of this conference in the next few days, but even more so, I'm looking forward to reading the results when you're submitting them as individual papers or as special issue proposals to Centaurus. Thank you so much, and looking forward to working with all of you in the next few years.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation of the Journal of the Society. So the Society and the Journal are going from strength to strength. And it's a pleasure also to see that the time of publication is quite rapid. It's very important for early career scholars to have publications out very soon. So it's a brilliant result already. So now I'd like to introduce a short video, once again, a little video by the organizing committee with Marco Beretta from the University of Bologna and Elena Canadelli, Sandra Lingueri and Paolo Savoia, who will welcome you to Bologna.
Welcome participants to the 9th conference of the European Society for the History of Science to Bologna, to this virtual conference we have organized. I would like, first of all, to welcome you on behalf of the Director of the Department of Philosophy and Communication that is hosting here physically this virtual conference, Professor Carlo Gentili, and he has put at our disposal all the locals. I'm also thanking you on behalf of the Center for the History of University and Science that I'm actually directing, and with all the staff, we are taking care of the virtual conference. I would like to point out some events that you will look and find in the website of the conference. Aside from the program, there are cultural and social events. Among them, one of the most important is an exhibition entitled Scientific Icons, devoted to the self-representation of Bolognese scientists in early modern time. And of this conference that we were hoping to show you in presence, we have also produced a video that will give you a glimpse of Museo di Palazzo Poggi that is hosting this exhibition. You will also be able to download the catalog in PDF, and on the website of the exhibition you will be able to browse all the objects that have been exhibited. Aside from this, in addition to this exhibition, there are other events, movie that either we have produced or that we are hosting on behalf of other colleagues who have suggested and given us these important videos, such as a movie devoted to Italian physicist Edoardo Amati. you will find other events by browsing our site, and I invite you to do so. At last but not least, I would like to thank the chair of the local organizing committee, beginning with Elena Canadelli, Sandra Linguerri, and the webmaster Paolo Savoia. We have been chairing the organization of a complex extraction, and we want really to send an heartfelt thank to the technical staff, to the administrative staff, to doctoral students, to postdoctoral students, and all the volunteers who made this conference possible. I hope you will be able to benefit from all the work we have put at service for you, that you will have a most enjoyable conference, and I hope to see you in presence in Bologna as soon as possible. Ciao to everybody.
And as you've heard, so Anna has given you an overview of the wonderful plenaries this afternoon, and there's been a presentation of the journal. Bologna has also built within the website a number of sites where you can explore the exhibition and also some of the videos. So I warmly encourage you to go to the website of the conference, where you'll also find the virtual book exhibit. I'm glad to say we managed to get together 9 publishers with wonderful discounts. So I hope you will make the most of the virtual book exhibit, as well as all the resources on the website. Now it's a pleasure to introduce the president of the Society for the History of Science, and also the head of the scientific committee, together with Maria Conforti, Ezio Vaccari, who is going to welcome you on behalf of the Society.
Dear participants and dear colleagues, on behalf of the Italian Society for the History of Science, I would like to warmly welcome you to this conference in a virtual Bologna. As you know, the Italian Society for the History of Science is one of the organizers, one of the local organizers, together with the University of Bologna, together with their Center for the History of the Universities of Science and Sciences of this Department of Philosophy and Communication of the University of Bologna. Our society, it's a small society, it's a small national society, but in the recent times we had undertook several new tasks, and we can now say that our aim is working for growing, also within an international context, we hope. That's why when we proposed the Italian candidature in London 2018 to host the organized this Congress here in Bologna, we were very determined, but also very aware of the extent of this task. But when last April we decided, together with the European Society, to change this format in an entirely online conference, we realized soon the high level of this new challenge, as well as the hard work involved. But we could not expect, and that makes us really, really glad, really happy, an attendance of this size, like the size that we face now in this conference. We are talking about more than 600 participants, 600 registered participants, which is quite equal to a normal conference in presence. So now, just a few words about the scientific program. You have received through the mailing list already some information about how the program is being prepared. And you know that there are a series of sessions distributed in 90 slots for symposia and 30 thematic sessions. This means 11 parallel sections during all the morning and the afternoons of the next days. There will be also 2 roundtables touching different aspects of what is the topic of our conference. A topic which was discussed in London. It was particularly important also for us, for our Italian historiographical tradition, but we think is extremely interesting for interdisciplinary links. So we're talking about visual, sensory, and material histories of science. And we also are convinced that the program, as it came out, thanks to you, thanks to your contribution, this program has a very strong interdisciplinary approach in a real sense. Not only the symposia, which were in some way created for answering to the different questions and issues of our topic. So I thank all the organizers and the conveners of the different symposia who really understood the mean of our topic. But I'm also talking about the individual papers, quite an impressive number, who was quite easy to divide in different thematic sessions. They fit well in different topics. So also that is a sign of the real understanding of what was the meaning, what was the aim of our symposium towards this interdisciplinary and very open speaking approach. As you have seen in the structure of the program, there will be space not only for presentation, although I recommend to keep very strictly the time assigned to everybody, because an online conference has limits, and even more limits than the present conference. But in all these symposia and thematic session, there will be wide space for discussion. And so this is also very important to have a plenary discussion at the end of every slot. I would like to conclude with a few thanks, but first of all with the statement. The statement is that we were very lucky in our organizing work, because we had the possibility to work as a real teamwork and to have a very constructive interaction with the board of the European Society of History of Science. And I thank in particular Anna Simoes, Simone Turchetti, and all the other presidents for the interaction we had. So we were able to build this new format of online conference in a very shared way. And so I would also like to thank all of them, but of course, all the friends, all the colleagues of the organizing committee, already been mentioned, but I would like to mention again, Marco Beretta, Sandra Linguerri, Elena Canadelli, Paolo Savoia, Monica Azzolini, and several others who were given a great sense of teamwork together. And the colleagues of the scientific committee, mainly from the board of the Italian Society for the History of Science and from the board and the officers of the European Society. They all worked very quickly, in a very helpful way when we were asking for reviewing papers and other questions. I must say that I've been honored to chair this scientific committee with my friend Maria Conforti, who really helped me a lot in all these organizing matters. And last, but certainly not least, I would like to thank all the students, University of Bologna, and the PhD students that in these weeks have worked with us very hard and trying to solve problems for connections and other issues that will be important in this incoming week, because we have to start. I'm thanking them for what they have done, but we have now in front of us a week of work where they will be very precious. We really are delighted about the interest, about the trust, about the appreciation and the encouragement that came from all of you who have constantly given to us during these difficult last months. It was hard times for all of us, but this idea to organize together a conference in a new way gave us also a new strength. And this support, which we realized it was sincere from the email, from comments, was very important for us. Somebody in this email even wrote that in this conference we were making history. We don't know, of course. This is, of course, is something that we can't say, but certainly, as historians, as we all are historians, we simply hope to have contributed in this way to the development of the studies and the research in the history of science, in a good history of science. So, thank you all, good luck, and have a nice conference.
So I guess this is all for now for the welcoming remarks. We would like to invite you to join us again at 4 o'clock Central European Time for our plenary sessions. It's going to be a fabulous program with short presentations, and that is going to lead us to the end of the day. And then tomorrow we open up with the sessions, thematic sessions, and the symposia that you can browse through the program. So once again, very much, thank you very much. 3 o'clock.
Yes.
Very much, thank you very much for your kind patience with the technology, and also with all the difficulties that we encountered while working through this new system. And see you in a little while for the opening up of the plenary sessions. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. All. You see me? You hear me?
Yep. Yes, Erwin, I hear you.
It's a great pleasure to. Shall I make my microphone a little bit less, or perhaps it's better like that?
Now it's better. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great pleasure to see you here all for the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize lecture. I first of all would like to thank Anna for the nice word about this prize. Then, in second instance, I would like to thank also the society to make this all happen and make it possible. Because it was only thanks to Robert Folks that we could start this prize once, and now for the first time the prize is not 10,000 euro, it's 20,000 euro. And with this, it's about the same height as the Fields Medal of the American Mathematical Society. And everybody who knows how prestigious the Fields Medals are, and I hope and will ensure that this whole story goes on. But for the moment, my only obligation is, in some sense, to present you the winner. And I hope now, otherwise I will have to make it different. I hope you see the slide now. I have to start it. PowerPoint. Okay. I mean, if it doesn't work, you see the, if you doesn't see, you see it, the sheet or not, I will read. Kostas Stavroglou was born in Istanbul in 1947, where he was raised. Having gone through undergraduate and graduate studies in Great Britain, he was trained as a theoretical particle physicist in the United States, where he held a postdoctoral position at the State University of New York. In 1970, he went to Greece and moved gradually from modern physics to the history and philosophy of modern physics. Kostas has published many books, among others, Methodological Aspects of Development of Temperature Physics in 1989, Fritz London, A Scientific Biography, and History of Artificial Cold. And he's one of the founders of the international group Science and Technologies in European Periphery, STEP, in 1999. So, in awarding Kostas Stavroglou the 2020 Gustav Neuenschwander Prize, the ESHS Scientific Board Council in particular acknowledged his contribution to the history of science, encompassing the study of science in the Greek-speaking world during the Enlightenment, the study of science in the European periphery, the history of universities, and the investigation of key transitions in physical sciences, including the foundations of quantum chemistry and low-temperature physics. Second, his role in building a community of historians of science in Greece and in fostering the teaching of history of science at various educational levels. Third, his active involvement in fostering international collaborations among historians of science in several countries, especially across Europe and its peripheries. And last, his extensive networking activities in other parts of the world, uniting various communities of historians, central and peripheral, consolidated and emerging, also senior. I don't see any. So this is the rest. And now you have a great pleasure to listen to Kostas Kovroul. Thank you very much.
Thank you and hello to everyone. I hope you
Yes. Bisogna scriverli. He's back.
I'm back.
I'm sorry. Is there somebody here from Bologna to help us?
I'm okay on my side. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so you should start speaking.
Okay, I'm starting again if we are okay.
Yes. Go ahead. Let's try.
All right. Hello, everyone. I would like to start by expressing how thankful I am for being awarded the Gustav Neuenschwander Prize of the European Society for the History of Science. My special thanks go to Professor Erwin Neuenschwander, who so generously instituted the award, and to the President and the Council of the Society, who I'm sure had to choose among a number of colleagues who have made impressive and lasting contributions to our discipline. I also feel especially privileged to be realizing that the work of those honored before me has been formative for my own understanding of the history of the sciences. Their contributions have deeply educated me. If I can point out to one common thread of the works by Claude Debreu, Jürgen Wren, Nancy Siraisi, and Robert Fox, is the intriguing questions they raised and the anti-dogmatic character of their approaches. It appears that I will have the rather dubious honor of being the first recipient of the prize who will talk twice, the second time hopefully in Brussels. However, I'm truly sorry about this, since the physical presence in Bologna would have given us the opportunity to exchange views in ways that are not possible through the new media, especially since even a quick look at the program shows how vibrant our community has become, how many younger colleagues are engaged in the discipline, how many different issues are being discussed, and how many different approaches are being explored. I would also like to thank our Italian colleagues for organizing this incredibly complicated conference. My sincerest thanks go to my Greek colleagues who have made these past decades so creative and enjoyable at our Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Athens. Theodor Arabadzis, Yannis Christianidis, Telis Timbas, Manolis Patiniotis, Stathis Psilos, Kostas Dimitrakopoulos, Stathis Arapostathis, Efthimios Nikolaidis, and of course the late Fedra Papanelopoulou, and of course the late Yorgos Goudaroulis, together with many of our graduate students, we collectively managed to put the periphery to the center, to have created a community in Greece that has been participating dynamically in the developments of history of science internationally, as in fact has been the case with our colleagues from Portugal and Spain. And this would not have happened if our colleagues from the center had not been so very helpful and supportive. My personal work has been in the history of low temperatures, in the emergence of new subdisciplines like physical chemistry, in the history of quantum chemistry, and in the relations between center and periphery in Europe during the 18th century. However, I shall not waste your time on the intricacies of these subjects and the answers to some of the issues raised. Perhaps in Brussels, I may be able to comment on some of the historiographical issues common to all these areas. Today, I wish to share some thoughts about our discipline, especially regarding its future. I shall necessarily be rather schematic, hoping to be more analytical in the final paper. Let me then come to my title about the Sisyphean fate of historians of science. The Sisyphean tale is often thought of as the punishment which expresses the perpetuity of pointlessness. Sisyphus cannot put the boulder on the hill, since every time it reaches its destination, it tumbles back, and Sisyphus is obliged to push it uphill again. This part of the Sisyphean tale is known to almost everyone. What, however, is not known is what caused the outrage of the gods to give him such a punishment. Sisyphus, having gone to the underworld, managed to trick death, not once, but twice, and succeeded to return to our world. He thus gained fame for his trickery and intelligence, and Homer referred to him as the most cunning of men. But the gods could not tolerate a human to be more cunning than themselves. They thought this was a wrong message to the rest of the humans, and so they punished Sisyphus. I shall hold on the ancient myth and will not be drawn to Kafka's admirable analysis of the myth itself. History of science, during the last 150-year history, just like Sisyphus, has managed to trick death twice. For many decades, almost all scholarship produced in history of science was intended for an audience of scientists. But decades of the most sophisticated scholarship was met by benign neglect on the part of the scientists. It was not an insignificant part of the community of historians of science who time and again raised the question, who are we writing for? Who is listening to us? Who is reading what we write? What effect our findings are having on the education of scientists? The answers to these questions were depressingly clear, and the work of historians of science was repeatedly confused by scientists as either being philosophy or some kind of popularization of past scientific achievements. Our community's attempts to talk to scientists and to engage them in our discussions came to a dead end. Facing the insistent rejection of its intended audience did not provide any heartwarming prospects for the survival of our discipline. Yet, despite being mistaken for philosophy or popularization, despite the passive stance of the scientists towards it, history of science managed to trick death by slowly and painstakingly creating its own audience. To be fair, I'm referring to research scientists, mostly working in universities and research centers, for it is an unmistakable victory of our discipline that it has caught the great interest of educationalists, especially those who work in schools, and these people have produced a truly interesting corpus of work. In fact, the journal Science and Education, with the indefatigable Michael Matthews at its helm, proved to be one of the most successful publishing enterprises of the discipline. The second time history of science managed to trick death was when social constructivism came into being through a series of insightful yet scathing criticisms against every single issue that traditionally history of science stood for. We were told that power relations almost uniquely determined physical entities, that there was a legitimate epistemological symmetry between correct and incorrect theories, and the same explanations had to be used for successful and unsuccessful knowledge claims. Contingency appeared to be reigning supreme in any attempt to unfold a narrative about a particular incident in the history of science, and that science could be understood only within the more general context of knowledge, and there was no special status to it. Objectivity, causality, truthfulness had all come under the incisive scrutiny by some very able scholars. Methodologies in history of science which had been forged after decades of discussions appeared rather naive. However, at the beginning of this stormy situation, many historians of science adopted the same attitude toward the strong program as the scientists had toward history of science: benign neglect. The threat of death appeared again forever menacing. Slowly, though, there appeared signs that history of science would get up from its deathbed without succumbing to social constructivism's aggressive agenda. I must note that to many historians of science, and surely to myself, liberation came through the work of a towering figure in the philosophy of science. Ian Hacking's Social Constructions of What gave most of us the assurance that everything is not lost, that there were all kinds of cracks in all the schemata, and the enigmatic yet elusive question mark in the title of the book signaled the richness of the debate rather than a dogmatic insistence on a particular viewpoint. After the protracted fight with constructivism, history of science cunningly exchanged one of its constitutive characteristics in order to continue enjoying the blessings of this world of ours. There was to be no more serious internalist scholarship anymore. Internalism, as a distinct way of doing history of science, became an exponentially waning part of history of science. The progressively blotting out of internalism from contemporary history of science is perhaps one of the momentous transformations of our discipline. I'm not sure how and whether this state of affairs is causally related to the appearance of the strong program in the 80s, but surely there is a strong correlation between the two. Peace was at long last in hand, death was tricked yet again for the second time. Tricking death twice may have brought the discipline on par with Sisyphus, and in fact with an additional advantage. There did not seem to be any serious punishment. This blissful state of affairs, however, for history of science did not last for long, since a new death threat became well entrenched, not through the neglect on behalf of the scientists, nor by the criticisms emanating from Edinburgh and Bath, but by the ideology of utilitarianism emanating from the bureaucracy of the European Union. Even though historians of science have proved themselves to be incredibly adaptive with respect to serious challenges to their discipline, presently we all face the most dangerous of all the challenges so far. That is the almost forceful instrumentalization of the humanities and the social sciences on behalf of the European funding bodies, and especially the Horizon program. Will history of science survive Brussels prioritization schemes? The Horizon program is the main program funding research in Europe, endowed with tens of billions of euros. Up to now, the humanities and the social sciences had their own niche. They comprised an independent category for applications, just like all the other disciplines, such as health, biology, informatics, energy, etc. But in the New Horizon program, this category has disappeared with the following rationale. As a cross-cutting issue of broad relevance, social sciences and humanities research is fully integrated into each of the general objectives of Horizon. Embedding social sciences and humanities research across Horizon is essential to maximize the returns to society from investment in science and technology, is what it's written in the introductory blurb of this big program. Every single word in this document is highly problematic. Every single word is indicative not of a shift away from the humanities and the social sciences, but rather of the forced change of their legitimizing context. It used to be the case that the humanities and the social sciences did not need any justification. To deconstruct this trend of utilitarianism for the humanities and the social sciences, we as historians of science, we need to go outside our discipline. We need to articulate a strategy which is not only for history of science, but together with others for the humanities and the social sciences. We have to find strategic allies among the practitioners in the humanities and the social sciences, and to try to articulate an anti-instrumentalist and an anti-utilitarian strategy. We should seek allies among the scientists. As is the case in similar circumstances, the solution is not to go back to the past, to try reminding of our virtues to the people in power. They know them, they just do not care. We need to articulate a convincing agenda for the future, not only for history of science, but together with others for a number of disciplines. The failure to convince scientists about our research agendas, the confrontation by social constructivism, may appear in retrospect soft challenges compared to what we are facing today, which unfortunately is not limited only to the European funding bodies. This threat, the third death threat to the history of science, may perhaps be the most serious of all. If we manage to overcome it, perhaps the gods will marvel at our cunning abilities and stop punishing us. Who knows? Thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank Gustav very much for his speech, and unfortunately we have no time for questions, but if you have questions, you may ask him directly on email, on our media, and he will certainly be happy to answer them. Thank you once again to everybody. Bye-bye. Next session.
Thank you.
I have a call from Gustav Neuenschwander online. I don't know what to do with this. Do you have it too?
What?
The call now.
A call? No.
It's a call by Gustav Neuenschwander.
Yeah, I'm here, but I didn't call anybody. I don't know what's
You
happening.
appear as calling. Okay, doesn't matter. I will hang out.
Yeah, okay. Nice speaking to you, but I can't help.
So probably we can start, right?
Yeah, for me it's okay.
Shall we start? Okay. So let me start to introduce with great pleasure Theodore Arabatsis. He will become the president of the European Society for the History of Science in just 3 days. Theodore Arabatsis is professor of history and philosophy of science at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. His research has focused on the history of the physical sciences, on historical philosophy of science. In 2017, he was awarded the Essay Prize in History and Philosophy of Science by the International Union History and Philosophy of Science and Technology for an essay entitled "What's in for the Historian of Science? Reflections on the Value of Philosophy of Science for History of Science." He is presently the leading investigator of a project on the perils of prediction in the physical sciences funded by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation. Theodore Arabatsis has therefore dedicated a significant part of his scholarly work to think about relations between history of science and philosophy of science and to find practical ways to connect them. A founding member of the Greek Research Council for the Humanities, he has done so within the wider context of a reflection on the place of the history of science in the humanities. His choice of talk for the presidential address bonds these two research interests. It will certainly prove particularly relevant to think about ways to consolidate the position of history of science in Europe within the broader landscape of the humanities and to affirm the European Society for the History of Science as the guiding forum for such discussions. For those of you who did not attend the opening session, let me mention that adjustments to the virtual format in which this conference is taking place include the format of the 5 plenary lectures. As such, this presidential address will be delivered in a concise format, more congenial to a virtual environment, to be readdressed in full in 2022. As such, a smooth continuity between the 2 succeeding biennial meetings of the European Society will be secured, extending the Bologna spirit well into 2022. I give the word to our next president, my dear colleague and friend, Theodore Arabatsis. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is everything okay with the sound? It is okay. Well, thank you, Anna, for this kind introduction. I would also like to thank the local organizing committee and the Italian Society for the History of Science for doing a tremendous job against all odds, and I mean these words, with the organization of this conference. The other officers of the European Society for History of Science and I personally are deeply grateful to them for offering a huge service to our society. I would also like to thank our president, Anna Simoes, our vice president, Tony Marlet, and the other officers of the society for a smooth and fruitful collaboration over the past 2 years. Having witnessed the extraordinary commitment and hard work that is required for running our society, I will assume my responsibilities with considerable trepidation. Now let me move to my talk. It will be a very brief sketch of a topic I've been thinking about and hope to develop in the coming year. From the very first stages of its professionalization, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the history of science has been seen as a bridge between the natural sciences and the humanities. However, only one part of this triadic complex, the relations between the history of science and the natural sciences, has been extensively discussed, and Kostas Gavroglou focused his talk on this part. The other part, the relation between the history of science and the humanities, has been less commented upon. In this brief talk and in the published version that will follow, my aim is to make a small step towards redressing this imbalance by discussing the relationships between the history of science and two other humanistic disciplines that have been historically and institutionally associated with it: the philosophy of science and, in lack of a better term, general history or mainstream history. I will suggest that both of these relationships exhibit characteristics of an unrequited friendship. On the one hand, historians of science have, for the most part, ignored calls of collaboration from their philosopher colleagues, and on the other hand, historians practicing other branches of history have, again for the most part, been rather indifferent to the efforts of historians of science to understand science as a historical phenomenon. I will end with a suggestion about resolving this problem, but again, this is very much work in progress, so my suggestion will be very brief, and I'm sure will leave much to be desired. Now, let me start with more or less familiar territory, the relationship between history of science and philosophy of science. In a recent publication, I have discussed that relationship from the point of view of history of science. My starting point was the observation that the discussions on history and philosophy of science that extend back to the 1960s have been skewed towards philosophy of science. The focus of those discussions, has been the relevance of historical case studies to the generation and appraisal of philosophical claims. Remarkably, I think, historians of science have been conspicuously absent from that debate. On the whole, and as a community, we have remained largely indifferent to philosophy of science and looked to other fields, anthropology, psychology, and sociology most prominently, for methodological guidance. As a result, the historiographical potential of philosophical reflection on scientific practice has remained largely unexplored. Now, the days when philosophy of science pontificated on the ideal characteristics of science are largely and happily over. So there are many areas of contemporary philosophy of science that can be brought to bear on historiographical issues and concerns. In the publication I mentioned, I have attempted to spell out the added historiographical value of engaging with philosophy of science. I have argued there that philosophical reflection on meta-scientific concepts, such as experimentation or discovery or conceptual change, can be historiographically fertile. Such reflection can elucidate historiographical categories, justify historiographical choices, and thereby enrich and improve the stories that we tell about past science as a knowledge-producing enterprise. There's no time for going over the details of that argument. For those of you who are interested, I'd be happy to share that publication of mine. The point of bringing up this work here is to suggest that there are plenty of opportunities for reviving the relationship between history and philosophy of science, but this time in our terms and for our benefit, not for the philosopher's benefit. Now, let me now move to the relations between history of science and other branches of history. In 1971, in a seminal article on the relations between history and the history of science, Thomas Kuhn argued that history of science is a field of history. He pointed out that its methods, values, and aims do not differ from those of, quote, other sorts of history. At the time, it was important to stress the historical character of history of science. History of science back then was a relatively new field with an uneasy relationship to history. Internalism was the main game in town, and general, quote-unquote, historians had trouble relating to the often technical work of historians of science, and thereby maintained a distance from our field. Things look brighter today, although I think still far from satisfactory. As a result of the consolidation and expansion of the history of science community, so clearly manifested in the phenomenal growth of our society, we can now afford the luxury to address our work exclusively to our peers, and we feel no pressing need to reach out to other sorts of historians. But there is a price to pay for that luxury. Let me immediately qualify this claim. The relations between history of science and other sorts of history vary in different countries. For some time now, in the US, history of science has been integrated, for the most part, into history departments. Many historians of science are employed in history departments, and fewer are scattered in HPS departments or autonomous history of science programs. Even fewer can be found in science departments. This institutional situation has affected, for better and for worse, the kind of work that is produced by historians of science in the US. Several of the topics that have been explored in recent years, such as science in the city, science and colonialism, science in the environment, to mention just a few, have brought history of science much closer to mainstream history. Further, the work of historians of science and technology has been integrated to a significant extent in general treatments, textbooks, or syntheses of American history. In Europe, on the other hand, and here I can only be impressionistic, the gap between history of science and mainstream history still persists. Most historians of science work in HPS departments or programs and in science departments. As a result, the integration of history of science in European history is much weaker. At worst, history books on 19th and 20th century Europe barely mention science and technology. I examined quite a few general accounts of European history, and to my unpleasant surprise, I realized that science and technology are missing from the stories that they tell. At best, books of this kind include brief accounts of the developments of science and technology, which, however, are not integrated into the larger framework of 19th and 20th century history. It's a platitude among this audience that science and technology have been a key factor in social, cultural, and economic developments. I would preach to the converted if I argued that general history needs to integrate the history of the sciences. However, I think we still need to get this message across to our historian colleagues. We should make clear to them that we have been doing our history homework and that it's high time for them too, mainstream historians, to do their own history of science homework. So what needs to be done? As Kostas Gavroglou said, and we didn't really talk about this, so it was a happy coincidence. It is crucial for our development as a field to cultivate our relations with cognate fields in the humanities and the social sciences. Some of the challenges and the opportunities that we face are common to all of us. And a close dialogue with those fields is a sine qua non of flourishing in the precarious times that we live in, where the humanities as a whole are threatened with extinction. One way to move forward is by finding areas and topics in the history of science where productive engagement with philosophy of science on the one hand would be possible and fruitful, and areas and topics in general history on the other hand, where engagement with history of science would be necessary. Now let me close very briefly with one such suggestion for overcoming the barriers between history of science and its philosophical and historical interlocutors. A great deal of what we as historians of science are concerned with has to do with understanding the contingency of scientific developments. This interpretive task requires us to be clear on the epistemic uncertainties that are endemic in scientific research. And here a philosophy of science has an indispensable role to play. As philosophers of science have argued, some philosophers of science at any rate, contingency is operative, among other reasons, because the epistemic constraints at play in scientific practice often leave room for alternative beliefs, choices, and actions. Furthermore, and here is a role for general history, the contingency in question is entangled with the impact of wider historical trends on scientific practice, an understanding of which requires to reach out to general historians. What I have just presented is a mere outline of a problem, the solution of which I will attempt to flesh out in the published version of the lecture and will present in full detail at the Brussels European Society for the History of Science Conference. For now, let me thank you for your attention and conclude with a warm welcome to all of you. The richness of the program that will unfold over the next few days testifies to the vibrancy of history of science in Europe and makes me optimistic about its future. Have a great conference. Let's have a great conference. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Theo, for a very nice talk, sharing with us lots of interesting ideas concerning how we should really strive to affirm our field in connection with humanities. I think that people or colleagues could use the meeting chat to ask questions if they want Theo to develop these ideas or to incorporate them in his future paper. So feel free to participate actively in this ongoing work in progress. And I think that for now, I just thank Theo. I wish everybody a wonderful conference, and we'll have a short break before listening to the 3 talks of our early career scholars awardees. So everybody, thank you, and see you very soon in another room. Bye-bye.
Emílios.
Clara.
Good morning. Good morning, Atil.
Morning. Welcome you all. It's my pleasure to introduce this first early career scholar lecture. Clara Florenza will be the first speaker. There will be 25 minutes for her talk and 5 minutes for questions. So we have to stay straight in time. I will be very short presenting Clara, who is teaching at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology and one in Physics and a PhD in History of Science. She's been visiting at the University of Cambridge and working there. And her main interest focus on mutual construction of science, within the political regimes, the relationship between ideology and religion, issues related to circulation of scientific discourses within the public sphere. And in particular, she had done a PhD, a work on the evolutionary theories under the Franco dictatorship in Spain. So a wide and broad interest. And now, as you can see, the title of her talk will be Agnotology, Epistemologies of Ignorance and Invisibilization Studies in the History of Science. So, Clara, it's up to you. Please mute all your microphone while Clara, of course, is speaking, and then we will have time for questions, written or speaking. Please.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the ESHS. It's an honor for me to give this lecture and to address you all. Well, in her illuminating work, The Speculum of Ignorance, in 2006, Nansutuana stated, I quote, "If we are to enrich our understanding of the production of knowledge in a particular field, then we must also examine the ways in which not knowing is sustained and sometimes even constructed," end quote. Since Tuana's work, based on feminist activism, many have argued convincingly, extending her work to other fields, that as we try to unravel the processes of construction of knowledge and scrutinize concepts such as authority, trust, or truth, we should equally be concerned to unravel the processes of construction of ignorance, and thus problematize and set to scrutiny the inexistence, invisibility, or invisibilization of, that is, the processes to render invisible certain knowledges. In 2008, in his introduction to agnotology, the term proposed by Robert Proctor for these studies, he showed his astonishment about how little we know about ignorance. He complained that, I quote, "A great deal of attention has been given to epistemology, the study of how we know, when how or why we don't know is often just as important, usually far more scandalous, and remarkably under-theorized," end quote. Since then, mostly from the STS field, ignorance studies have produced a variety of illuminating concepts, such as Hess's unknown science, Frickel and Kinch's geographies of ignorance, and Tuana's epistemologies of ignorance of resistance movements. Agnotology scholars have also unveiled different types of ignorance, such as the strategic or acknowledged ignorance, the manufactured doubt or uncertainty, and the unfortunately once more topical male-socialized ignorance, what he calls white ignorance. These scholars have highlighted that invisibility, doubt, or ignorance are not natural states of the population, simple absences of information or knowledge, but the outcome of active and effortful social, cultural, and political processes. Science often being at the core of the production of ignorance these works unveil. Tuana argues that epistemologies of ignorance are often integral to resistance movements, as they fight to undermining the production of ignorance about a specific topic, with the aim of extricating it from oppressive systems often based on this ignorance, and thus creating alternative knowledges. For this reason, she identifies resistance movements as, I quote, a helpful site for understanding how to identify, critique, and transform ignorance, end quote. This might explain why a good part of the historiography in this field has focused on activist or reformist movements around feminism, health, or environmental issues. But what about epistemologies of ignorance in dictatorships, where resistance is not only forbidden, but strongly repressed, where activist movements are suffocated in their alternative knowledges are censored and silenced? How do epistemologies of ignorance work in this scenario? Are they absent? Are they less evident but follow the same processes already described in democracies? Do they have alternative paths? And finally, will the study of the production of invisibility and ignorance in dictatorial regimes contribute something novel or original to ignorance studies or history of science in general? I will try to offer some answers to these questions. Through the presentation of my research, I will argue that the study of science in dictatorships, underrepresented in these ignorance studies, can provide illuminating approaches to this field. Drawing from Olga Kushinskaya's concept of lay invisibility, I will explore the construction of lay ignorance in two areas of the history of science where the agnotological approach is not common, but might be challenging, such as the history of neo-Darwinism and the history of science diplomacy. I will do it through two case studies from Franco's dictatorship. Franco established a philo-fascist reactionary nationalistic and Catholic regime in Spain from 1939 to 1975. I will show how the construction of invisibility and ignorance around certain scientific knowledges was part of the construction of Franco's regime, in many more senses than just censorship and violent repression, and how scientists and scientific practices became key actors in these processes. Taking action on behalf of the population, allegedly for their safety, is typical for dictatorships. This needs, beside the more evident practices of domination, cultural and social mechanisms to render these people's voices invisible. Paradoxically, these people appear often in the discourse of the actors, the leaders of and ideologists of the regime, but under homogenizing labels such as the man on the street. Their feelings, anxieties, and wills are exposed but never explored. Taking decisions on behalf of these invisible people, borrowing Maria and James Powell's title, is a routine process for dictatorships. And among these decisions, there is often that of preventing certain knowledge to circulate, that is, constructing ignorance or invisibility in the public sphere. Of course, this is not at all unique to dictatorships, but needs to be more nuanced in democracies. My claim is that the study of the construction of ignorance in dictatorships can help us recognizing and rendering these processes visible in democracies. Olga Kushinskaya has argued brilliantly in her work on the production of invisibility of Chernobyl's fallout consequences in Belarus that lay people perception of radiological contamination is always necessarily mediated. Given the lack of immediate experiential confirmation of either radiation or its effects, the experience of imperceptible hazards needs instruments, signals, and other ways to visualize them. Its perception needs formal representations, among them narratives. As I argued in my PhD thesis, during Francoism, Darwinism was perceived. I don't know why my presentation is not here anymore. Here. Okay. Okay, so Darwinism was perceived and constructed by ideologists of the regime as a dangerous scientific theory, especially when reaching the public sphere. Francoist elitist narrative constructed the risk of Darwinism as if it were an imperceptible hazard. Such as, can you see it? No, you know. Oh, can't you see my presentation?
Somebody, no, it's better if you load it again, Clara, please. Sorry. Somebody had charged his own video by mistake.
Okay, don't worry. I'll share it again.
Somebody from the audience.
Okay. I'll share the screen. Then. Now? Yes. Is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
If it happens again, please tell me.
Of course.
Okay. Okay. I was with my first case on Darwinism, and I was saying that during Francoism, Darwinism was perceived and constructed by ideologists of the regime as a dangerous scientific theory, especially when reaching the public sphere. Francoist elitist narrative constructed the risk of Darwinism as if it were an imperceptible hazard, such as radiation. The alleged effects of Darwinism in the bodies of its consumers could not be immediately perceived. They did not produce skin marks or vomiting or immediate madness. Francoist elitist narrative made sure to render lay people's senses or capacities to perceive it non-functional. This justified the role and need of the ruling elites. To discern whether a knowledge was harmful or not, lay people needed to rely on their elites as experts in this matter. Francoist ideologists and their propaganda constructed and circulated the formal representations of the risk for lay people if they got to consume neo-Darwinism. They talked about social and moral risk in health terms. They diagnosed metaphorical bad digestion for non-trained stomachs and literal disorientation. And they envisaged a global coexistent social problem due to moral perversion caused by neo-Darwinism-driven loss of values. In their view, neo-Darwinism and the materialist idea of man it was constructing, disguised as neutral science, was fostering the spread of communism and the crisis in which Europe was, in their view, immersed. Elaborated theoretical frameworks by Francoist ideologists, among them scientists, helped constructing the risk through which they justified the invisibilization of neo-Darwinism in the Spanish public sphere. Construction of ignorance for the well-being of the population. This first led in Spain to a complete evolutionary silence that lasted for 10 years after the dictatorship was established. It was a construction of popular ignorance, a lay ignorance on evolution, not only neo-Darwinism, but any kind of evolutionary theory. After 10 years, in the early 50s, evolution started to gain its pace in the Spanish public sphere again. Mostly by scientists, especially paleontologists, who wanted to promote their research and complained about this silencing. They defended and circulated an evolutionary narrative that kept distance to neo-Darwinism and did not focus on chance or materialism to explain evolutionary change. They claimed evolution was absolutely compatible with the ideology of the regime and its Catholic fundaments. The Francoist Information Department got involved in the construction and circulation of a discourse about evolution said to be, I quote, rigorously scientific, balanced, and orthodox, apt to be put within reach of the general public, end quote. Some of the most renowned Spanish scientists in the field, together with philosophers, politicians, and journalists, were summoned for that matter. The result was that during the 50s and 60s, whilst neo-Darwinism was still made invisible in the Spanish public sphere, a finalistic theistic version of evolution was fostered. Scientists taught this evolution in courses for journalists and in popularization courses with a varied audience ranging from attorneys to housewives. What historiographical challenges or contributions does this analysis offer? This case shows that the construction of neo-Darwinism's invisibility in Franco's Spain and the over-visibility of an alternative narrative was part of the social, cultural, and political construction of Franquism. Scientists involved in it are to be considered ideologists of the regime. Thus, construction of invisibility was a tool for the construction of science and Franquism. Besides, this invisibilization of neo-Darwinism in favor of an over-visibilization of an alternative version of evolution as the privileged knowledge allowed me to unveil another level of invisibility in this story, a historiographical invisibility. I argue that the active campaign to make visible this version of evolution and those promoting it makes of Franco's dictatorship an ideal historical case to study the others in the process of constructing the so-called evolutionary synthesis or neo-Darwinism. Thanks to this strong promotion of a non-Darwinist view of evolution in Spain during the 50s and most part of the 60s, I could reconstruct an international network of active scientists, some of them well-known and renowned, that were critics of neo-Darwinism in scientific terms, much later and with more commitment than is acknowledged in current historiography of evolutionary thought. Traditional historiography states that orthogenesis and finalistic evolution was not defended in scientific circles beyond the late 40s, except for some scattered outliers, some of them usually studied as such, works on the center shown here. But historical evidence tells otherwise. From the Spanish case, I found international meetings, debates, collaborations, and papers discussing orthogenesis, even in journals such as Evolution. These activities involved international scientists and aimed at establishing an alternative synthesis, a continental one, as they labeled it, in contrast to the American school in their terms, which they considered too narrow and rigid. Key figures of neo-Darwinism, such as George Gaylord Simpson, scientifically collaborated with them, participated in their activities, and engaged in their debates, opposing their views. And there is still work to do to reconstruct the practices and composition of this group of dissenters, part of which the neo-Darwinist Everett Olson labeled in 1960 as the silent segment, of which he had no doubt that the numbers were not inconsiderable. The Continental School and its work for an alternative synthesis has been understudied in the historiography of modern synthesis, and thus has become invisible. I claim that we cannot understand the construction of neo-Darwinism properly without studying the interactions with the other, in opposition to which neo-Darwinism was constructed, thus without making the other visible again in the histories of modern synthesis. Now I move to my second case study on science diplomacy. On January 17, 1966, 4 nuclear bombs fell onto a town of 2,000 inhabitants on the south coast of Spain called Palomares, contaminating with plutonium an unprecedented wide area. With this case, I will show how the production of invisibility was a key tool in the US-Spanish negotiations to manage the crisis that followed the accident. The professor of American Studies, John Howard, asked himself 4 years ago in January, I quote, This month, with little fanfare, Palomares begins its 50th year as the most radioactive town in Western Europe. If you've heard about Fukushima, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island, but are unfamiliar with Palomares, you might wonder why. End quote. As I argued in this article, a public campaign orchestrated by diplomats, politicians, military journalists, and scientists was designed to render the risk and thus the consequences of the whole accident invisible. A campaign that turned out to be very successful. One of the most celebrated and well-known moments of the public management of this crisis was the image that showed the Spanish Minister for Information, Manuel Fraga Iribarne, and the US Ambassador in Spain, Angel Vidal-Duque, having a bath in a beach near Palomares, waving at the cameras. To accompany the image, the US ambassador made the following statement in a wet swimsuit in front of the micros. Spanish and US scientists have declared repeatedly that there is no danger for the public health in the Palomares region. Neither is there any vestige of radiation in the sea. The image was intended to become a symbol of safety and was widely reproduced by the international press, making front pages, some labeling it as a demonstration of diplomacy. It also inspired innumerable cartoons. The construction of ignorance and invisibilization of radiation risk aspects of the diplomatic bath performance were many. Despite there was still a bomb in the sea that had not yet been recovered, and it was not clear whether it was damaged or not, the vast contaminated areas were on the mainland, where 2 bombs had spread their nuclear content. There, thousands of American soldiers were protecting the area with radiation counters, some of them protected with complete suits and masks, filling drums with tons of highly contaminated earth and crops to be buried. They did not appear in the picture, neither did Palomares' inhabitants. The most dangerous hazard the population was facing resided in inhaling radioactive particles suspended on air, or ingesting contaminated food, a risk that was not visualized, neither acknowledged. Thus, the image of the diplomatic bath constituted a formal representation to invisibilize radiological risk. Significant enough, some days after the bath, urine samples of Ambassador Duque were sent to a radiological lab to be analyzed, labeled in red with priority. Why was the Palomares campaign so successful? I suggest that a key factor was that those who designed this campaign were acquainted with certain strategies of ignorance production used by some US industries and companies. Angel Vidal-Duque, the US ambassador and key person in the campaign's design, was heir of the American Tobacco Company. As Proctor has shown, the US tobacco industry was involved in a construction of ignorance about the harmful effects of smoking, which involved science production and strategic advertising. In this analysis of the diplomat's bath image, I will focus on the latter. Borrowed from making claims such as more doctors smoke camels in the 1950s, the US tobacco industry moved to more subtle inducements in their advertisements, associating smoking with youth, vigor, and beauty, that is, health. To do so, this industry relied on powerful marketing tools. The Palomares campaign benefited from first-hand expertise in such marketing tools. Duke's wife, Robin Chandler Lynn, in fact the one who came up with the idea of the diplomatic bath, had been PR director of Pepsi during the so-called Pepsi-Cola Wars. Thus, although seen by many as a Francoist icon, the image of the bath could be seen through this analysis as a product of US cultural hegemony in Greek sense. In the picture, both diplomats were waving and smiling at the camera with a jovial, unworried, and healthy expression, despite the cold. The image evoked the imaginary the Pepsi ads had been spreading in the Spanish press for 10 years with the slogan, "Do not take it so badly, take it with Pepsi." The Palomares case provides many more examples of the production of invisibility, and thus lay ignorance than just the diplomatic bar. Minimizing public attention to radioactivity-related actions was listed in official reports of the accident as a crucial point on the US-Spain negotiation table. The minimum public attention criteria shaped the negotiations on levels and methods of decontamination, and acquired epistemic agency when, later, these thresholds would be shared and published in scientific forums and used to establish radiological protection standards. The diplomatic negotiations and agreements leading to them resulted in measures that made radiation risk invisible to the public sphere, and thus limited the public perception of radiation hazard. This invisibilization also allowed for the establishment of a US-Spanish joint research program designed, I quote, "to determine how great the risk would be to people living there during all or the greater part of their lives, including infancy and childhood," end quote. An invisibilized, ongoing laboratory, as they called it, that would last for 40 years and needed loads of extra science diplomacy. In my view, the Palomares case suggests that agnotology and epistemologies of ignorance are crucial approaches to science diplomacy studies, and should be taken into account in the formation of the theoretical framework of this rising field in the history of science. To conclude, dictatorships could be seen as singularities in political, social, and scientific terms. But as more insightful studies of dictatorships are undertaken, such as this for Francoism, and the more the intertwining between science, ideology, politics, military strategy, and economics is studied in democracies, the more it shows that many dictatorial practices are also present in democracies, although just less obvious, and that the acknowledgement of their existence in dictatorships makes us more able to detect them in democracy, becoming also an interesting tool for ignorance studies. More than ever, in the post-truth era and times of massive privatization of scientific research, we are indeed in need of a deeper understanding of the production of ignorance. And it is our responsibility as historians of science to inquire the role of science in it. Besides, the agnotological approach as a reflexive tool will help us to keep the question, is there any undone, invisibilized history of science, always fresh in mind, and to be attentive to the mechanisms, practices, and hierarchical systems of power at stake behind it in our discipline. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara, very much for this very interesting lecture. Now we have a very little time left, but if there is space for maybe one question, if somebody wants to pose a question, please write Q question in the chat or write the question in the chat directly.
There is a question by Silvia Cayanello in the chat.
I cannot see it. Where?
I just wanted to understand which.
Ah, yes. I see a lot of
alternative version of evolutionary theory.
Sorry?
They are asking about what is the alternative version of evolutionary theory you were referring to during your talk.
Yes. Well, this is they were fostering or trying to found an alternative synthesis in sense that they wanted a finalistic version of evolution. Some of them were believed in orthogenesis. That is that lines in research. There are some preeminent trends in evolution. And this was opposed to what neo-Darwinism was saying at the time. There were also other forms of dissenting, of course, because in France, for instance, the Lamarckism was still discussed, and also in Spain at the time. So there were different types of dissension that were discussed together, and they were trying to have a common discussion to try to find an alternative synthesis to the one that was, as they saw it, the Anglo-American centered, and they thought that it was too rigid and too they had alternative views to it.
Thank you. On a very short question that was left by, okay, Sylvia may pose her question, so we can, I think, finish now because we are a bit over time. And I can see all the comments on the talks, on the chat. So, Clara, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you can continue maybe the discussion maybe also in the chat, but there is this other, of course, plenary lecture taking place in another room, starting right now, the early career scholar lecture 2. So I thank you all. Thank you, Clara, again. And let's meet to the next room.
Thank you. Jo no puc veure les...
Doctorate in History of Science from Harvard University. His research interests include, but are not limited to, the social history of early modern European surgery, with particular interest in pain management, and the history of face reconstruction and face perception. He has published widely in articles, book chapters, and essay reviews about these topics. In 2017, he published in Italian the book, I hope my Italian is acceptable, Cosmesi e Chirurgia, Medicina, Bellezza e Dolore nella Italia Moderna. And in 2019, in English, he published Gaspari Tagliacozzi and Early Modern Surgery, Faces, Men, and Pain. This has appeared in Routledge. Today, he's speaking to us about checking the surface.
Nicola.
Sorry, he's speaking to us about checking the surface, vernacular science, everyday knowledge, and observation in early modern Europe. Paolo.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. As Clara did before me, I just want to briefly thank the European Society for the History of Science for the chance they gave me to talk about my work here today. And by here I mean somewhere, even under pandemic circumstances. So I'll just jump into my topic right away for the sake of time. So what I'm going to try to do today is to talk about the knowledge and practice related to the surface of several kinds of bodies in early modern Europe, mainly from the point of view of the intersections between high and low culture, or, if you want, intellectual and artisanal ways of knowing. I will discuss areas of overlap in the expertise of physicians, surgeons, cooks, butchers, barbers, anatomists, earth scientists, and botanists, both men and women. These areas of expertise shared both sets of practical skills in manipulating natural surfaces and observational and epistemic techniques in order to understand natural bodies via their surface. While my argument is necessarily at the stage of a first attempt at treating the issue of what might be called surface knowledge, I will argue that such knowledge and the shared mental models of different experts of surfaces played a key role in the rise of what has been known for a long time as the scientific revolution. So let me take a few steps back. So why surfaces? The surface of natural things invites observation, manipulation, measurement, reconfiguration, and promises to unveil the knowledge of depths. I will begin by briefly situate my ideas in the context of historiography of science, recent and less recent. Part of my goal here is, in fact, to argue that some of the most important trends of 20th century history of science have found a new life at the beginning of the 21st century. So, on the one hand, I am connecting to attempts to get past the dichotomy between quantitative and qualitative knowledge, and between natural philosophy and the arts, and to explore the many different ways modern science has emerged, and what contribution non-mathematical sciences, or what Thomas Kuhn once called the non-mechanical arts, non-mathematical sciences, what contribution they gave to mental habits of observing, collecting, experimenting with, and manipulating natural things. On the other hand, this presentation today aims at pushing further the emphasis on artisanal knowledge, procedures, and on what has been called vernacular science and artisanal epistemology. So nowadays, the scientific revolution is known for being characterized by an exchange between humanist erudition and a passion for practice, or between high and low arts. Much work has been done, for example, on the so-called mixed mathematics and on alchemy, but less on the practices of artisans such as barbers, cooks, cheesemakers, gardeners, agronomists, and their relationships with meteorology, botany, natural history, medicine, and earth sciences. So I'm interested in how practical knowledge about the surface of things and bodies, also in connection with specific environmental conditions, led to conceptions of nature and matter as composed of layers, of corpuscles, of artificially reproducible solid parts, and how such framework contributed in turn to the demise of traditional Galenic and Aristotelian views on nature and animal and human bodies. The connection between artisans and natural philosophers or scientists is, of course, a hot topic in current historiography of science. This trend is also linked to the more recent history of knowledge category, which from the point of view of historians of science and medicine is more inclusive than history of science itself, and allows historians to think together in circular dynamics the tacit expertise of subaltern knowledge makers, including women, peasants, technicians, natives, and colonized peoples, for example. So to connect these subaltern knowledge makers with the higher level theoretical activities of the natural philosophers. Referring to the history of knowledge, in my case, I would specify to the history of procedures of knowledge of nature, also means to emphasize the fact that what is at stake are the relationships and the circulation between science as an institutional space devoted to the production of scientific knowledge, and, on the other hand, practical knowledge of natural processes for purposes other than knowledge or scientific knowledge. However, I would take this as an opportunity to broaden the picture, both in historical and in historiographical terms. While cultural and technical connections between artisans and scientists are much investigated, it would perhaps be advisable to put these narratives within wider social and economic histories. For example, back in 1942, this guy had Edgar Zilsel, of course, I don't need to introduce him, argued that a vast group of superior artisans, including surgeons, artists, gunners, navigation experts, and instrument makers, were both sociologically and epistemologically at the core of the innovations that came to characterize the scientific revolution. Zilsel believed that these artisans' sensitivity towards manual experimentalism and empirical observation eventually taught the scholars a new attitude towards the natural world in the context of a Marxist view of the history of capitalism as emerging from manufacturers and commercial enterprises of the 16th and the 17th century. But you know, Marxism is not the key here, although is of course important, since you know in the 1930s several non-Marxist thinkers such as Ludwig Fleck or Gaston Bachelard advanced very similar ideas. So it has certainly not occurred to Zilsel to include home-based or farm-based untrained men and women trafficking with natural, medical, and edible stuff, often without the ability to read and write, within the list of people bringing about the scientific revolution, which is precisely what a number of scholars are doing these days. But still, enlarging the topic does not mean to displace Zilsel's narrative. On the contrary, it means refining it. So much time has passed since Zilsel's work, and in more recent years, the idea that Renaissance and early modern artisanal knowledge led the way to the empiricism, the experimentalism, and the focus on observation and description of the new sciences has bloomed anew. Bodily engagement with natural matter and active pursuit of the inner workings and processes of transformation of nature have been tracked back to invisible technicians and artisans of all kinds and genders in all kinds of settings, from the court to the marketplace, from the household to the alchemical workshop. This historiography has rightly insisted on the fact that the history of early modern science and technology is not a chronicle of new inventions and theories, but rather a process of reciprocal influence of artisanal, naturalistic, and philosophical knowledge. And here on the slide I put a few names of books which I like, and but I not only I like, but I think are important. I will not talk about them since you are probably familiar with them, and they embody something that I like, broad trends that I am trying to describe here, and I'm trying to connect to. Now back to surfaces. This idea of the link between the manipulation of surfaces and the history of knowledge comes from the sources. I have done some work in recent years on things as different as surgery and cheesemaking. Thinking about practicing with and observing surfaces can be thought of in terms of shared cognitive models to make sense of practice, experience, and eventually experiment. similar semantic areas connect things as different as the peel of fruits, the skin of animals in humans, the bark of trees, and the fur of animals. And I can only give a few examples today. Here's one. In his 1582 manual for professional food cutters, the Italian trinciante Vincenzo Cervio included a very interesting description of how both barbers and butchers, in his words, illegitimately serve as professional food cutters. And their ability to, to use Cervio's language to anatomize the meat on the tables of the gentlemen. Cervio argued that barbers were unable to cut the meat in a proper, polite manner, and what emerges here is a significant overlapping in the technical spheres of people who cut: butchers, barbers, cooks, professional food cutters. On another section of his book, Cervio describes the art of peeling the skin of fruits, always connected to the knowledge of the substance of fruits, which was treated by a number of European books on cookery and gardening throughout the early modern period. These handling skills closely recall those of the anatomist and the butcher, as said. After having described how to separate the cuticle from the cutis, and here we are moving towards the mainstream and the heroes of the history of science, Vesalius wrote, "This is something we learn from butchers as well." I will, cut short the quote. These are not the only matters that are well known among butchers. They also know the nature of cuticle, etc., etc. But among the most coveted fruits in the early modern period were citrus, and here we are moving towards the core of my example today. Between the late 16th and the first half of the 17th centuries, visual and written descriptions of citrus fruits, along with a widespread desire, a social and cultural desire, and sensory desire for them, reached a peak in early modern Europe. Paintings, natural history treatises, botanical repertoires, farming and gardening manuals, etc., all praised the virtues and appearances of citrus fruits from a variety of points of view. While, of course, citrus fruits, essentially oranges, lemons, and citrons, were part of the tradition of medieval dietetics, dietetics, that branch of medicine classifying vegetal and animal products according to their humoral complexion. By the middle of the 17th century, some books counted as many as 80 varieties of citrus fruits and meticulously described their surfaces, often employing the same Latin terms used for skin, which is, of course, cutis. The first monograph, although a very short one, he calls him un tratadillo on citrus fruits, which broke with the tradition of medical dietetics, was written by Nicolas Monardes, the famous physician from Seville, who had traveled in the New World and published in 1540. But here I put an example from Pietro Andrea Mattioli's famous commentary to the Greek botanist Dioscorides, which contained a series of detailed illustrations of the citruses and shown a good deal of attention to their surfaces. Still more detailed images appear in Johannes Camerarius' Kräuterbuch, published in Frankfurt in 1611, where citrus fruits were represented in a new visual dissection or anatomical style, where the surface was placed along with sections of the interior, thus connecting the inner and the outer bodies of the fruits. In the same period, the famous northern Italian agronomist Agostino Gallo devoted an entire section of his treatise on farming to citrus gardens, praising their commercial value, among other things, of course. From Gallo's description, it also clearly emerges that citrus fruits were shown off on the tables for their aesthetic qualities. I'm not going to read these quotes, but I've put them here so that you can take a look at them, even if briefly. But the most lavishly illustrated treatise on citrus fruits was written by the Jesuit Giovanni Battista Ferrari, and it's entitled Hesperides, published in Rome in 1646. Ferrari was a professor of Hebrew at the Roman College, and after the election of Pope Urban VIII in 1623, he became the gardener, or as it was called, the horticultural advisor of the Barberini family. He took full advantage of the documents gathered by Cassiano dal Pozzo, an eclectic collector and natural historian, and an eminent member of the Accademia dei Lincei, the Academy of the Linceans, who had collected information on citrus trees and fruits from gardeners working all over Europe, but especially from the Italian regions of Campania and Liguria. Playing with the old trope of the garden as a place of spiritual peace and delight, this book combines naturalistic descriptions, gardening techniques, and mythological accounts of the origins of citruses, and was illustrated by the likes of Domenichino, Guido Reni, Poussin, Romanelli, Pietro da Cortona, etc., etc. The 80 illustrations, including those showing hybrids and the teratological transformations of citrus fruits, are mostly by the Dutch engraver Cornelius Bleumert, and some of them were made with the aid of a microscope. Here, again, an example of the language. It looks like Ferrari was describing a human skin. Notice the language. Besides the countless representations of citrus fruits in paintings, a real what we might call it a citrus mania is evident from the account of the traveler, the nobleman, and the traveler Joseph Furzenbach, traveling to the Ligurian city of Sanremo in the early 17th century. Citrus fruits were used and described for commercial, aesthetic, medical, naturalistic, and technical reasons. For example, the juice was used in the process of chemical tincture to obtain the color incarnatino. The emphasis on the peel, skin, and surface is to be linked to the contemporary emphasis of genres such as historie, observaciones, and descripciones, as Gianna Pomata has authoritatively shown in the past years, in the natural sciences, which emphasize the external appearance of the natural objects, and in turn were influenced by commercial and technical descriptions of the integrity and peculiarities of such surfaces. Now, I wish to briefly underline another stream of ideas connecting different bodies in the name of surface, earth sciences. Comparisons between the surface of the earth and the surface of the body were common in the 16th and the 17th centuries, just as those connecting the skin to the peel or the bark of trees. As shown by Maria Conforti, comparisons to the skin were made by physicians studying the particular volcanic landscape of Naples. One of them, Alsario Croce, dubbed Vesuvius an aposteme of the earth. Aposteme, of course, is a technical surgical term to describe swellings on the body. Purulent swellings on the body. Early modern geological knowledge from 16th century Italy to 17th century Britain to the 18th century was all about the ways in which humans and the environment interacted with the surface of the earth. The Latin term strata, layers made of chronologically accumulating sediments, was used for the first time by, of course, by Niels Stensen in the 17th century with reference to rock layers, and it, as it has been said, involved a conceptual revolution. Stensen gave new conceptual shape to ideas circulating since the beginning of the 16th century, most prominently in the writings of Leonardo da Vinci and Bernard de Palissy, about the surface of the earth as a deposit of successive layers or sediments, and therefore revealing the features of the earth in itself, not as a sign of something else. About 30 years earlier than Gerolamo Mercuriale's famous description of human skin, Vannoccio Biringuccio began his book on metallurgy and the arts of fire by drawing analogies built on what people looking for ores by inspecting the surface of the Earth reported. The ores, show themselves almost like the veins of blood in the bodies of animals or the branches of trees spread out in different directions. Manuals for barber surgeons written by eminent members of the guild in Italy paint a picture of the human body which is strikingly different, both from the Galenic style internal, both from the body of the Galenic style internal physician, which was of course a body crossed by humors, and the anatomical body. Rather, this is a body which is marked by superficial characteristics: the network of the veins to be opened for bloodletting, the softness of the skin to be cauterized, the parts of the surface on which cupping glasses could be applied. I'm going to draw some preliminary conclusions. Historians of early modern science who have been very attentive to its relation with forms of popular knowledge and metaphors have described the knowledge of nature as a process of penetrating its secrets. We all know that Caroline Merchant famously described Baconian science as a gendered enterprise of penetration/knowledge of a female nature that in the 17th century ceased to be active and creative and became passive and mechanical. William Eamon, building on Carlo Ginzburg's work on clues, insisted on the conception and metaphor of science as hunt, venatio, for the secrets of nature, which moved from the realm of popular knowledge to discussions on natural philosophy. This epistemology of hunt and of penetrating the interior of nature was for Eamon one of the most relevant origins of the new philosophy of the 17th century. For Eamon, nature's secrets became more than a metaphor. They became the belief that the true mechanisms of nature were hidden beneath the exterior and superficial appearance of things. Now, while I believe these accounts retain a certain salience in explaining what was the new science of the 17th century, I am arguing that the idea of going deep into nature, of explaining the true nature of matter, are not necessarily at odds with ideas and practices of manipulation and observation of the surface of matter. It is perhaps useful to apply Mary Fissel's notion of bodywork. The notion of bodywork is a tool she used to broaden the view on the early modern vast range of ways of caring for human bodies through active bodily engagement. So we can perhaps apply this notion of bodywork to non-human natural bodies as well, such as animal and vegetal bodies. Different bodies of nature could be worked out by different actors with different expertise, all sharing a special attention to the surface of such bodies. In a context of increasing proto-industrial manufactures, global commerce, new mechanics of social distinctions, and new ways of exploiting the natural resources through agriculture, gardening, and mining, surgeons, natural historians, butchers, physicians, and merchants alike found their way into natural matter via observation, manipulation, and assessment of its superficial strata. For many early moderns, bodily engaged with nature, surface was not just texts to be read for signs of inner deep truths, although they were also that, and then thrown away, but material objects to be studied and worked out as part of nature or as a layer of nature. Surfaces acquired more degrees of autonomy in the early modern period, and experts of early modern knowledge paved the way to the hunt for the secrets of nature. As a result of shared cognitive models rooted in the economic and social life of early modern Europe, the nature of these artisans and scholars was a layered nature, made of solid bodies, where all layers could reveal some truth, some secret, some technique. Surface and depth came to be perceived as part of the same nature with the same ontological dignity. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Paolo. We are very short. We have most time. We have just time for one question. Please, if anybody wants to make a question, write it on the chat. I have a question. This, how do you think this connection between skin, earth, the human skin, the earth, and the fluid, how do you think this ends up having some kind of reflection in the fascination with skins and surfaces in early modern art? I know it's a very general question, but you kind of provoke it, if I can say so, with the images you show to us.
Yes, I know there's. I know there's art historians have done a lot of work on surfaces, and not only on the surfaces of the material support of artworks, but also on represented surfaces. So I guess artists were artisans. It is hard to distinguish between artisan and artisan in the period that I'm studying. So I guess there are direct connections between people working as artists, as what we would call artists, artisans, and natural philosophers. The example of citrus is telling, because this citrus mania is something that both involves the commercial world, the scholarly world, the literary world, and the artistic world. There's a blooming of representation of the peel. The peeled skin of citruses in this period. So I mean, there are direct connections that can be, of course, I hope, historically proven. Of course, people, in terms of people talking to each other and observing each other's expertise.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we don't have time for more.
I know.
Thank you very much, Paolo.
Thank you.
It's a very wonderful, provocative talk.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Most striking images of the coronavirus were the images that my colleagues came up with fell roughly into 3 categories. Scientific images of the virus and graphs about its development. Photographs and short clips of empty city spaces, and artistic responses to the situation, sometimes humorful, sometimes rather melancholic, pensive, or shocking. To be honest, I was surprised by the results of this round of answers. It must have been my own predisposition towards science and my desire to find a certain security in the understanding of the epidemiological crisis that made me mainly look at images of the virus and the enormous number of graphs we were bombarded with, especially in the first weeks of the European part of the epidemic. However, the answers of my colleagues opened my eyes to understanding that the visual culture of a global health crisis is more than its scientific imagery and should be studied together in its context. Since the topic of the entire conference and also my paper is visual, material, and sensory cultures of science, and since the coronavirus is the whole reason that this conference is online, I do wish to zoom in briefly on the by now well-known image of the coronavirus. Created by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, in the USA. Why was this image made? With which intentions? And what does it actually show us? The image, endearingly called the spiky blob, was made by 2 professional medical illustrators, Alisa Eckert and Dan Higgins, who work at the CDC. Instead of using photographs made with electron microscopes, the illustrators created a 3D model of one single virus with the use of specialized software, in this case a program called Autodesk 3ds Max. According to the interviews the creators have given over the past month, the aim of the image was on the one hand to give the virus an identity and educate the public about its nature. Secondly, the image was also supposed to grab the public's attention, and I quote from the New York Times, "The spike's long shadows were calibrated to help display the gravity of the situation," end of quote. We see thus a twofold aim in this image, to educate and to warn. If it is possible to manipulate an image so much to gain these 2 goals, what is it actually telling us? What do we see when looking at this model? Once more, I'll quote from the New York Times. "The novel coronavirus, like all viruses, is covered with proteins that give it its character and traits. There are these spiky proteins, or S proteins, the red clusters in the image, which allow the virus to attach to human cells. Envelope, or E proteins, represented by yellow clumps, help it to get into those cells. And membrane proteins, or M proteins, shown in orange, give the virus its form," end of quote. The S proteins that bind the virus to human cells are the reason that the virus is especially dangerous and contagious, and therefore the illustrators decided to color them red. They gave the virus's sphere a greystone color so that it looked like it could be touched, while the shadows are only there to enhance the sense of a tangible object. My follow-up question would be whether we need to know all this as a non-specialist reader of an image. How important is the awareness that, in looking at this image, we are dealing with an artificial and manipulated representation of the virus? Altogether, this image demonstrates that the study of visual communication in science can teach us things about the current level of scientific knowledge. For example, how much we know about the various shapes, forms, and folding patterns of proteins on the surfaces of viruses and human cells. It can tell us something about the goals that the illustrators and their superiors had when creating this image. Here we should pay special attention to the use of red, the danger color of the S proteins. And we could also try to understand better how the image was received and read by a wider audience through further research involving interviews, questionnaires, etc. With this example, I wanted to draw your attention to the use of images, to the questions we can ask about these images, and the answers we could anticipate in directing our attention to uses of images as the source material for our inquiry. And keeping this example in the back of our minds, I now turn to the European early modern period, which will form the historical context of the rest of this paper. Let me show you another famous image, the flea from Robert Hooke's Micrographia, published in London in 1665. This image was the first ever image of a flea in such detail. It is displayed in on a big fold-out page measuring 43 by 33 centimeters. Here we can ask many questions again. Who made this image? How does the image relate to what Robert Hooke saw through his microscope? And what did the readers of Micrographia make of it? Robert Hooke most likely drew his own observations, and these drawings were then engraved by a professional engraver for publication. More importantly, though, this is a compound image. It would have been impossible for Robert Hooke to have seen one entire flea in all this detail and sharpness with one view in his microscope. He would have had to look many times through this microscope, each time moving the flea slightly to focus on another part. And thus, this image is also a constructed image. Did the image mislead its readers? Not necessarily, as the image certainly shows its readers how Robert Hooke perceived a flea to look like. As with the image of the coronavirus, Hooke was communicating to his audience something that they could not see with their naked eyes. Only with the help of instruments, in his case a microscope, could one see in this level of detail the minuscule insect that he had drawn, and it's only through the visual communication that other people could see this. The image was there to educate its readers and to make them marvel at God's design. After these brief examples of scientific images and some questions we can ask, I turn to the historiography of the field that I will call early modern visual cultures of science. It is in the past 20 years that historians of science have come to a full appreciation of the significance of the visual dimension of early modern science. In following the visual turn that impacted the humanities and social sciences in general, the field has started to develop the intellectual toolkit needed to do justice to this source material within a broader understanding of how science is and has been practiced. Highly adapted to the field of art history, the time has come not only to consolidate this bond between these two fields, but also to integrate other fields of early modern history, such as book history, media studies, and material culture studies. For reasons of time, I can only mention a small selection of representative authors and their works that I think have been groundbreaking in opening up their fields to studying the visual in early modern science. I will start with historians of science interested in the visual, followed by art historians interested in the scientific. In history of science scholarship, Lorraine Daston has undertaken early and important work on images in science. She wrote several articles on the concept of epistemic images and co-authored the book Objectivity with Peter Gallison, a book that continues to influence our current understanding of the role of images in the history of objectivity and subjectivity. Since the history of scientific images is so strongly connected to the history of observation, the collected volume Daston edited with Elizabeth Lundbeck is also invaluable in this context, the history of scientific observation. Important work, fundamental work, I would say, on the role of diagrams as part of the visual tradition of history of science started much earlier, with the philosopher John Murdoch's 1984 album of science, Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Apologies for the bad image. This has been followed by pioneering publications such as Transmitting Knowledge, edited by Sachiko Kusukawa and Ian McLean in 2006, and the collaborative article on scientific imagery by Christoph Lüthi and Alexis Smets, who from 2009, which is still one of the important articles on understanding diagrams, images, epistemic images. An even more recent direction within this field has been charted with research into print culture in combination with the role of drawings and their different roles. Impactful works by historians of science for this topic are Volker Remmer's 2011 Picturing the Scientific Revolution, Sachiko Kusukawa's 2012 Picturing the Book of Nature, and also, for example, the work by all the collaborators on cataloging the Paper Museum of Cassiano del Pozzo, a project that has recently been finished and now consists of 20 volumes of catalogues, with extensive essays at the start. Also worth mentioning here is the journal Nuncius, which has been devoting special attention to the visual and material cultures of science since the 1980s. The journal is published by Brill under the auspices of the Museo Galileo in Florence. And with its Italian home base, it also offers a different perspective on the historiography of the field, one that is less Anglo-German than I'm presenting here today. Parallel to this research conducted by historians of science into images in science, also art historians opened up their discipline towards the study of the scientific in art history. While scientific images were for a long time of little interest to art historians due to their often minimal aesthetic value, we have the contributions of several art historians to thank for the introduction of these sources into art history courses. A starting point was made by Svetlana Alpers in 1983 with The Art of Describing. Her argument that 17th century Dutch art was more than Italian art based on scientific observation has provoked many responses, both positive and negative. In any cases, it has prompted the field of art history to looking differently at the role of observation and the science of sight in the context of producing art. A large segment then of the bridge between art and science was contributed by Martin Kemp, who has published widely on visualizations in art, science, and medicine, who's not read that much anymore, but was an important instigator of the field. The German art historian Horst Bredekamp then has also contributed in major ways, not only with his work on Galileo as a draftsman, of which you see the corrected version here, but even more with his research team that has tackled more theoretical questions related to the question of the technical image. And here you see the German and English book of that title. He was at the forefront of a discussion to rename art history into Bildwissenschaften, in English mostly translated as visual studies, to which I will return shortly. Two final examples of more specialized studies that nevertheless have had a great impact are David Friedberg's 2002 book, The Eye of the Lynx, on the 17th century Rome-based Académie des Lynchets, a study done entirely based on its images, and Susan Dackerman's 2011 exhibition catalogue, Prints and the Pursuit of Knowledge, which has become a standard work for scholars in early modern print culture and knowledge production. All of these scholars, whether art historians or historians of science that have written the books I've mentioned before, acknowledge the fact that they were venturing outside their disciplines by developing interdisciplinary approaches to the subject matter. The strength of the field of visual cultures of science lays exactly in its willingness to combine different analytical approaches, which is proven by the high number of collected volumes on the matter of art and science, to which colleagues of both fields have contributed. Historians of art, I would say, more than historians of science, have already developed a more general understanding of the early modern visual culture in general. And by extension, I would argue, art historians have therefore also a better understanding of the visual culture of science due to their systematic analysis of images in light of their form and function. Questions asked include how these images were understood, how they were used at the time, who made them and how. And from a more historiographical perspective, questions have been posed about the appropriate methods with which to study these images. The history of science approach asks about the role images play in the production of scientific knowledge or knowledge in general. All of these questions form part of a long-standing, unresolved debate revolving around the common name that should be given to these types of images, connected with the debate of form and function. The Anglophone literature alone has put forward labels of epistemic, scientific, or knowing images. While the approaches by historians of art and historians of science may differ, and their focus may be attracted by different subject matter, we also see strong national and cultural variations in the approaches towards the study of early modern visual cultures of science, something I also do hope to explore further for the publication that comes out of this. But as Alex Marr has written, the various approaches and subdisciplines can be grouped under terms such as early modern art and science, Bildwissenschaft, and visual studies. And although these labels and names have been of great value in drawing attention to these images and in broadening the primary sources that both art historians and historians of science can use for their studies, in my opinion, it is time to look beyond or across the borders of the disciplines and fields to get to the questions and answers that interest us. And although the variety of disciplinary backgrounds of interested students and scholars entering this debate can be a challenge at times, eventually it enriches always our discussions and generates new insights. This idea of crossing borders is not only important between the history of science and art, but also between the many studies that have been published already in the broad field of visual cultures of science. Many of these works by both art historians and historians of science have concentrated on specific fields or persons of science, such as, for example, mathematics or astronomy. And I'm showing one slide here with some examples, which, without going into detail about these authors or their works, but it shows all the differentiation in scientific fields of the early modern period, and also concepts such as maps or diagrams. And we needed to do this, but now we can start to bring these different histories together as well. After a good 2 decades of wide-ranging research into the early modern visual culture of science by both historians of science and historians of art, the time has come to pull all these efforts together and integrate them. Attempts have certainly been made already, for example, by Klaus Henschel, who published in 2014 the monograph Visual Cultures in Science and Technology, A Comparative History, which is a fantastic book, but leaves also a lot for early modernists to add. The book by Overgel and Rasgen Morris and their collected volume on Baroque science, and also the very recent 2020 volume, The Visualization of Knowledge in Medieval and Early Modern Europe, edited by Marcia Kupfer, Adam Cohen, and Yossi Chayes. But what is even more encouraging is that several large interdisciplinary research groups have started to work collaboratively on these topics. These groups include the former Max Planck Research Group Art and Knowledge in Pre-Modern Europe in Berlin, Images of Nature in Hamburg, the Making Visible projects in Cambridge, the ongoing project From Data to Wisdom on medieval and early modern data visualizations in Porto, the interdisciplinary laboratory Bild, Wissen, Gestaltung in Berlin, and my own Max Planck Research Group Visualizing Science in Rome, just to name a few. The research done so far by historians of science about the epistemic uses of visual material and visual communication in the various fields of science in the early modern world, conducted either by numerous individuals or by coordinated groups, make it now possible to compare various traditions of scientific visual cultures. Without all their work, we could not have started to ask broader questions. At the same time, historians of science still need to develop a greater confidence in using the theoretical frameworks that have been pioneered by art historians. In this manner, together, we are now in the position to connect these approaches. So how can we make this field into an even more collaborative laboratory in which we can ask new questions and push the field forward into the future? As the title of my talk suggests, I think that we can start to ask new questions about the impact of media changes on the visual cultures of early modern science. This allows us to start asking a set of new questions about the role of the visual in a wider context of early modern communications and the history of knowledge. How were visual representations of science impacted by the media through which they were disseminated? And how were media technologies shaped by contemporaneous visualizations of knowledge? What was the interaction between early modern thinking processes, knowledge acquisition, scientific practices, and visual communication at the time? First and foremost, this approach asks for opening our gates to even more disciplines, as I already mentioned, such as book history, media studies, and material culture studies. Only by adopting impulses from these disciplines into our methodology, we will be able to advance our own knowledge. To illustrate how this could work, I will use an example of my own research into the observational techniques of the Dutch microscopist Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Leeuwenhoek 17th century scholar amateur, is known for the microscopes that he produced himself and with which he was able to see incredibly small things that had never been seen before. He became the first to notice, for example, bacteria and the movement of sperm cells. And about a year ago, I spent 2 days at the Boerhaven Museum in Leiden with a fantastic team of experts, Sachiko Kusukawa and Katie Reinhardt from the Making Visible project, Tiemen Kokkuit, an expert on 17th century lens making from the Boerhaven Museum, Huib Zuidervaart and Douglas Anderson as experts on Leeuwenhoek's correspondence, Keith Moore, the head archivist of the Royal Society, and Wim van Egmond, a specialist in microphotography. We looked at some of the original specimens Leeuwenhoek had made himself and sent to the Royal Society in the 17th century. They're now in London, but they were brought to Leiden for the occasion. Here you see a section of a bovine optical nerve. The idea was that we would gain an understanding of what Leeuwenhoek could have seen and how he communicated about this. We took into consideration the decay of the specimens, our current understanding of microbiology, and the fact that we were using the original microscope but within a modern setup. These spectacular photographs were then compared with the drawings that Leeuwenhoek made or had made to understand what he had drawn and what not, and what his descriptions emphasized as important in comparison with the imagery that we could recreate. And in other cases, not in the case of the cow's nerve, we could also compare the drawings with the printed images to understand better how these images were copied and what contemporaries thought of as their important aspects that really needed to go into the next phase of the project. As you can see here, they're very similar in this case of seeds, plant seeds. This example illustrates how we can use images as primary sources to understand more about the observational techniques and practices of a 17th century microscopist. As a broader level, though, we can understand better how early modern scientific practitioners communicated their observations. They collaborated with artists who needed to be educated in the techniques of observations, in this case, a microscope. The information was conveyed through text and images and in letters, and later published in some of the first scientific journals, and book publications in the form of etchings and engravings. Media changes can be found on many levels in this case, in the use of printed images next to drawings, but also in the introduction of scientific journals, and in this case also the new technology of the microscope. Examining the impact of these changes on the way science was depicted will teach us even more than we already know about scientific practices, and also about the practices of early modern artists, the close relationship between science and printed materials, and the role of the object in relationship to drawings and verbal descriptions. A truly interdisciplinary field of early modern visual cultures of science beckons. I hope many of the participants of this conference will feel invited and inspired to explore further the roles of images within their subject of interest. And I hope that by enriching the field with your experience and expertise, you will help take the field into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sietske, for this insightful, amazing lecture about the visual that is one of the main topic of this conference. So maybe just we have 1 minute for one questions, maybe we'll see, but write in case please write in the chat. But a lot of compliments, Sietske. So we'll see. I'm checking for questions or comments, maybe.
Jenny has a question.
Okay. I don't see.
She hasn't written it out.
Okay. I don't see her, but she can ask. Okay, I see it. You can Jennifer, you can ask it. Or write it as you prefer, as you wish. So write it.
Microphone. Write it. Yeah.
Write it. Yeah. So, Siske, do you read it, Siske, or
yeah,
just?
Can you say something about how historians of scientific images have changed how historians approach texts? Yes, that's actually a wonderful question, because I started very briefly with the fact that historians of science responded to the visual turn that was impactful in the humanities and social sciences in general. And so it's not just history of science that started to work at images in general, but it's a much broader movement. And I do think that historians of science have gone particularly far, also in the collaborations with art historians, actually. And so the kind of convergence between art history and history of science has been especially fruitful for us, and therefore has been linked back to historians in general who actually have I think a slightly slower response to working on the visual and material culture, which is only really something that is strongly happening in the past 10 years. Using lots of the material from Lorraine Deston, Horst Bredekamp, the kind of visual cultures of science people I would, as I presented them today. So it's a response to what has been done in our field, I think, that has a major influence also in the general broader field of history.
Siske, very briefly from Klaus Henschel, disciplinary consequences for history of art?
Yes, they're actually large also. I was, in preparing this talk, I was looking at, I was trying to make a comparison between historians of science going into working with images and historians of art working on the scientific. And to my surprise, I think, in the end, I found that there are so many art historians who now work on things that are either scientific images or not the high art images that was not until 20 years ago the core of the art historical corpus. There has been a huge development within art history to also work on scientific images, non-core images of the art history corpus, I would say.
So thank you, Siske. Thank you all. We have to finish here. So thank you and enjoy the conference for the next 3 days. And see you in a virtual room. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Siske. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.